if you need one. Let's look at this, the way we go through these same categories is an attempt to try to show all this information as far as background. I usually kind of introduce this by saying, I don't know if you noticed the Hallow prayer ad that comes on TV from time to time. Do you know that? And I think I like it that it's free. It used to cost a whole bunch, and I was a little bothered by that. But they'll read something like Joshua, the first chapter of Joshua. It says, be courageous and courageous, the Lord is with you. And this is where the hermeneutical issue comes in. That was addressed to a man who just lost his mentor, which is Moses. And he's about to have to take these gripey Hebrews on a trip they don't really want to go on, and they don't like him either. Now, what gives anybody the right to pull one Old Testament verse out that was written to somebody under certain circumstances and say, this is God speaking to you? Do you hear the difficulty of that? Now, here's the other side of that. I think that what you have to do is find out what the author was saying to the people of that day. So here is Yahweh encouraging one of his leaders that he's going to be with him and for him and take courage, right? Now we can apply that. Maybe we could apply that to somebody in a military situation. But to just flippantly say, this is my verse and I claim it, I have some problems with that. Do you understand why? Because you can make the Bible affirm anything to anyone if you ignore the historical setting. Now, we know that God is with us and for us, and there are verses that say that. But I don't think I have the right to just take a verse out and say, this is what God wants for your life. I think I told you before, a young lady in one of my classes used to pick Jeremiah 29:11. I plan great things for you and all. And she said, this is my verse, I claim it. I said, well, this is written to a guy who God would not let marry, who his own family tried to kill him, who the king threw in a cistern, and his one book the king burned in front of him. How do you get the right to take that verse? So I just want to make that point to you to think about it, okay? Because I think that God is with us and for us, and I think the Spirit encourages us. We've just got to be careful on how we handle the Bible. Because when you do that to text, you can make the Bible say anything to anyone. And that's what we're got to be careful about, right? It is speaking to a particular group. I still like Gordon Fee so much. He makes this statement. It just was so powerful to me. It cannot mean what it never meant. Now think about that. How many times have people that I have met around the world find some passage on something and say, this is what this means, and it had nothing to do with that issue. Nothing. But if you pull it out, redefine the words, stick it into a certain setting, then you're thinking God is speaking. Now God is speaking, and He has given us this book. But He's saying to us, I spoke in a particular time to a particular group. This has meaning for you, but you must first find out what it meant to the first hearers before you apply it. And what I think we're doing today is what I call serendipity Bible study. I remember years ago, I was in a Sunday school class at First Baptist. President was in that class, a lot of the leaders of the church. And the teacher would read a text and then go around the room and say, what does this mean to you? And my really tacky response is, who cares what it means to you? I mean, what it means to you is not the issue of Bible study. What it means to you is the application of the intent of the original author. So I'm gonna land this plane. Every context has one and only one meaning, and that is the intent of the original inspired author, who is the only inspired person in Bible study. But every passage, and I would say a paragraph is the minimum, has multiple applications, And this is why the Bible can function across generations and across cultures and across languages, right? It is God's word to his people, but there is a two-step process instead of a what's in it to me question, right? You want to talk about that a minute, or does that bother you that I say that? Sure. Let me address that. I'm going to take it a little different way. When people say to me, the Spirit told me to do this, or the Spirit told me what this verse means, okay? And then they come to me and say, this is what this verse means. And I said, wait a minute. They said, well, the Spirit told me. I said, well, if the Spirit told you, you must act on that. No question about it, right? No question. But I don't have to act on it. So I would say, if in a time of crisis or need, and the Spirit gave a verse to you to meet that need, thank God the Spirit speaks to you. You can have that, but you cannot put it on somebody else and say, thus saith the Lord. Does that make sense? So personal application, I think, works on some level, but for a preacher and a Bible interpretation professor, I've got to limit what people can make Scripture say. And this is where, when students try to use typology or allegory, I'm just saying, look, apostles can do that because they're inspired, but you're not. You're illumined, and all Christians are illumined, but we disagree like crazy. So inspiration is a higher spiritual level than illumination. All I'm saying is tread carefully on text. Text have priority. Text in context have priority. Does that make sense? And if I could illustrate this, if I found one of your old letters written to somebody, your mother, your lawyer, your friend, and I read part of it today, just part of it, you would say, wait a minute, you've got to know when I wrote that, who I wrote that to, and you've got to read the whole letter. Do you hear God screaming that at us and how we do his book? Because we take little pieces out, unrelated to context, unrelated to history, unrelated to the original meaning of the words, and we say, this is what it is for me. Now, I think this, particularly new Christians, I think God bends over backwards to speak to them. But I'm saying this with a grain of salt to you. Once they hear me, they can never do that again. You can't just open the Bible and point your finger in a verse and say, God said. Once you hear about hermeneutics and a proper way to deal with the Bible, you can never do that again. People tell me, and you're going to realize it, I ruin every sermon you're going to hear. Because what I'm going to try to get you to do over and over is to say in your mind, where did you get that? Can you show me where you got that? How many sermons have I heard where a text was read, and then everything that said after that text had nothing to do with that text? It had to do with the opinion of the speaker. But the text was read to do what? Give the speaker divine authority. But once your eyes are open to this, you can't be tricked anymore. And suddenly, this is why you've got to learn to self-feed. The Bible was given to you, not to the pulpit, not to the academy. It was given to you, but you are responsible. Yes. Yes, what that does, those Tyndale, yes. Yes, it is. It's going to give you the historical setting, and it's going to give you unique grammatical features, and it's going to give you the lexical options for the words. Because what we have, when you go to a dictionary and you look up a word, let's say range, R-A-N-G-E, and it's got 1, 2, 3. It could be a range of a temperature, right? It could be where cows graze, and it can be where you cook dinner. Mountain range. Everything has to do with the literary context. Everything, and knowing what that word means. But see, we don't think about that when it comes to the Bible. So I just want you to think about that. I'm not sure I'm doing you a favor, but excuse me? Which one? What? I'm sorry. It's Tyndale. The Tyndale Old Testament and New Testament commentary, paperback. Used. Tyndale Old Testament, New Testament paperback. So let's look at the name of the book. Now, you do know that, let's just talk about this for a minute. There are no J's in Hebrew, right? So there is no Joshua. I mean, we get to heaven, we see this guy, we call him Joshua. He's going to go, what? Joshua and Jesus are exactly the same word. One is in Hebrew, Joshua, and one is in Aramaic, Jesus. Now, there's one place in the Bible, in Stephen's sermon, it's Acts 7, where it's obviously the Old Testament Joshua, but it's the Greek word Jesus. It really confuses you unless you look at the text. It can't be Jesus, it's got to be Joshua. So let's think about this word for a minute. It's in your notes, so you can look it up later. The Hebrew word for salvation is Hoshea, all right? And that's what this man's name was. But Moses changed it, and all the verses are here. And what Moses did, he added the covenant name for God, Yahweh. Now, you can do this two ways to a Hebrew word. You can put, for English now, it's J plus a vowel. It can be any vowel almost, but it's J plus a vowel, okay? That's a way to abbreviate Yahweh. Have you ever noticed at the end, not here, but some Hebrew names have IAH? That's another abbreviation for Yahweh. So either of those is a name that has Yahweh in it, okay? So this guy's name, and usually these Hebrew names are two nouns, and you got to put a verb in there. So it could be Yahweh is salvation, Yahweh brings salvation, Yahweh saves. You get what we're doing? We're taking two nouns and we're trying to make it into a descriptive phrase. And there's no way to know exactly what verb ought to go in there. A linking verb probably. Yahweh is salvation, Yahweh brings. You catch what we're doing. So Moses felt like this guy who was named Salvation is going to deliver his people like God's going to deliver his people, so he changes his name. Changing the name is so characteristic of major events in the Old Testament, because for Hebrews, names were almost like a prediction for the character and function of the person whose name you're changing. We get that from Jacob to Israel, right? But we don't know what Israel means. I know they may surprise you. We do not know what the etymology of Israel is. So if you look at this, I've given you the Acts 7:45. That's where you find the Hebrew name for Joshua. And then Jesus, you can see it in Matthew 1:21. Now this is the first book of the second division of the Hebrew canon called the Prophets. And we've mentioned before that for Jewish thinkers, you must be a prophet to write Scripture. So in Deuteronomy 18, Moses says, there'll come a prophet after me, right? So Moses is called a prophet, Deuteronomy 18. So these history books were titled by them the earlier prophets and the later prophets, because even though Joshua is never said to be a prophet, they entitle their history books as prophetic books. Now you can see that the earlier or former prophets are Joshua through Kings, except Ruth. Ruth's not part of that. The latter prophets are Isaiah through Malachi, except for Daniel and Lamentations. I'm redoing my commentary on Lamentations, and it's 4 of the 5 chapters are acrostics, which is the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet starts the next line. And they're very different from each other, which means that they're probably not written by Jeremiah, and they're probably not written by the same person. But tradition got it caught up. If somebody who saw the fall of Jerusalem was there, so Jeremiah was there, but it looks like there are multiple authors in that. And we just stuck it there. Tradition has it there. Okay, now notice, if you would, where the genre. This is the continued history of Yahweh's people, which begun in Genesis, and it's going to carry right on through. And what we're saying is this is a historical flow of how God has dealt with human beings and what he is trying to do with them. Now, you'll see that you can't see it in these notes, but do you see the 3 special topics down below genre? Old Testament is history, Old Testament historiography compared to Near Eastern cultures, and the genre interpretation of Old Testament narratives. Now, it just depends on how interested you are in history. History is really a slippery thing. History usually is one person's perspective of what happened at a certain time and place. And if you've got 10 people together, they wouldn't say the same thing, particularly if you're versing the ones who were affected and the ones who caused. It really is different. The Bible is a different kind of history. It's not a good history versus bad history. That's not at all what we're talking about. It's just not modern, Western, cause and effect, chronological history. That is not what it is. So we're going to skip generations. We're going to skip a whole lot of bad people. We're going to mention warts and all on the major leaders. And we're going to put things together so the author will make a point, just like Nicodemus and the woman at the well are put together. That's not Monday and Tuesday. That's two kinds of people. You understand? That's textual design. So this is a theological history. Now, please don't hear me say that I don't think this is historical. It's kind of like we fussed about the Exodus. I've missed seeing Early since that lecture. She may have got mad at me. Tell her I asked about her, would you? We're not doubting there's an Exodus. We are wondering when, where, how many, where's Mount Sinai? Those are questions we have to ask. But now, are we questioning the historicity of the event? Absolutely not. So I hope you'll keep that in mind. I did want to make a point, and I hope you have your pencil with you, on number B. I've added it to my notes. And history for the Jews is not cyclical. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you know that most of the religions of the ancient Near East are based on the cycles of nature. There is a dying God, and he or she is kept in the underworld for a period, and then another God comes and frees them, and then the spring comes, and that God dies again. It's this terrible cycle of fertility worship. That's the cyclical nature of most pagan religions. The Bible is not that. It is teleological. It has a goal. It's moving toward a purpose. It's moving toward a consummation, and that's what we got to keep in mind. Now, I have listed the verses in the New Testament that I think say clearly that the things that happened in the life of Jesus is the predetermined plan of God. I think that's an important statement. It wasn't a judicial miscarriage. It wasn't, oh my goodness, isn't this sad? No, this is the predetermined. This is not plan B. This has been plan A from the beginning. You say, where do I get that? Genesis 3:15. So here they are. I'm going to call them out slowly. You may want to write them in here. And I'm in number B, line 3, right after the predetermined goal, okay? Luke 22:22. And these sermons in Acts, oh my goodness. Acts 2:23. Acts 4:28. Acts 10:42. And Acts 17:31. Now, I know that's a bunch, but let me make a couple of more statements about this. There are so many people today who say this is what God is, this is what God wants, this is what's happening. So you ask yourself, who do you believe? I mean, so many people are claiming to speak for God and claiming to have truth. How do you know how to sort out false teachers from true teachers? Is that a good question? Well, I think one way to do that is to look at the apostolic sermons of Acts. Because now we're going to have Peter, Stephen, little a apostle, Paul, give a series of sermons to different people in different settings. Now what you say to yourself is there any unified doctrinal assertions that start appearing in all those sermons by those different inspired leaders? And there is. Now, it's a special topic. I'll give it to you. If you'll write it in your notes, you can look it up anytime. The word in Greek for to preach or proclaim is the word kerygma, Kerygma. Kerygma. It means to preach or proclaim. And the special topic is called the kerygma of the early church. And what I've tried to do is go through every one of those sermons and list the common items that these men preached. Do you hear what I'm trying to do? Going to the source, the main source of what the early church presented about Jesus to different groups. The kerygma of the early church. I hope you'll look at that. I hope you'll write it in here. I think it'll be interesting to you. Now, about authorship, as you know, most of the Old Testament books are anonymous. There is a chief character, and is it always true that the chief character of the book wrote the book? No, that's not true. There is a main character, and that's the purpose of the writing, to show what God did through this person. But that does not mean that that person wrote the book, right? I mean, I bet if there's a history about Eisenhower in World War II, Eisenhower didn't write the book. Now, somebody with him and knew him and a history, they did, right? So just because Ike didn't write it doesn't mean it wasn't true. So the same thing is true here. The traditional author is chief character of the book. His name is Hoshea. I'm giving you the verses. Moses changed it to Joshua, and that's Numbers 13:16. Number 3, and I don't know why this happens, and I don't think you do either. His name is spelled 4 different ways in Hebrew. Holy moly, is there that many dyslexic people in ancient Hebrew that you can't spell this name? Well, here's the problem. When you go from one language to another language in a name, it is really hard. Do you know Nebuchadnezzar is spelled different ways? So, I don't know why, but poor Joshua really got a number on him. There's 4 different ways, and I've given you the verses, and I've given you how they spelled it if you want to see it. Now, number C, this is the book of the Talmud that gives us traditional Jewish authorship of the Old Testament books. It's Baba Bathra 14b. It's part of the Talmud. It says, number 1, Joshua wrote the book. Then it says, except for the account of his own death, which was written by Eleazar the priest. Except Eleazar's son Phinehas wrote the portion of the book that deals with Eleazar's death. Now, don't you hear what we're doing? It's just like Moses, right? You got Moses in Deuteronomy. He's dead, and they're still claiming he wrote it. I mean, that's weird, right? So who wrote the last of that? Well, these men probably used a scribe. Someone to write it down. There were people in the ancient world who went to school for writing small print, because the material you write on is pretty expensive. They wrote small print, and that was their profession. And we call them amanuensis in the New Testament, and usually we call them just scribes in the Old Testament. So I'm sure some high priest wrote this stuff down for all of these guys early. But I want to say again, when I talk about authorship, really, 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 that's for historical setting. Because I think you and I would agree the author of the Bible is the Holy Spirit, right? And he just used certain human agents. Now, what human agents, how many, I think we can't do. But it is his book. It is about him. And so it doesn't bother me that we can't do that. Number D, a little bit about the man himself. He was born in slavery in Egypt. He was one of the 12 spies sent out to check out the land. Him and Caleb brought the only positive report. The other 10 didn't, and Israel is judged for a 38-year wandering because of their unbelief. He was Moses' helper. Matter of fact, it was Joshua that went up Mount Sinai with Moses, but only halfway. Moses went up the rest of the way. Joshua stayed behind. There's the text there. He is the commander of the Israeli army, such as it was. And I want to think about this with me. Remember when Pharaoh's army is killed when the waters come back? Now, this is absolutely miraculous. They floated with all that armor on, and the wind blew them to the side where the Israelis were, and that's where they got all their weaponry. Think about that. Now, this is a ragtag bunch of slaves that have to be turned into military units. So this wasn't a small task that Joshua had here. He is named Moses' successor. He led the conquest as Moses' successor. So this is where that chapter 1, all those encouraging words. Matter of fact, he's going to see the angel of the Lord in chapter 5, kind of a repeat of the burning bush for Joshua, right? I'm with you, Joshua. Don't get discouraged. These people gripe a lot, but I'm with you. I think we ought to call there's some Old Testament books that I would change the name to the Gripings because that's all that there really is in those books. Now, number E, some evidence for contemporary authorship. Now, I'm not saying this is Joshua, but I'm saying there is an eyewitness who was there and saw some of these things. So I've listed some of those. We know that Joshua could write. He wrote the law on a rock at one place, and he wrote the law of Moses on something else later. It says in chapter 5 that Joshua himself circumcised the children. Now, I'm not sure he did that to all those Israelites. He was the official who led the Levites to do that. But it says him, exactly. His private encounter with the angel of the Lord. Who knew that? It was only Joshua and God there. I think pre-incarnate Jesus, angel of the Lord. Joshua had to tell somebody about that. Then we have a Rahab. It says she lived in the midst of Israel to this day, Joshua said. Now, I do not think that's a later editor. That's somebody who's saying, she's still here. I think it's contemporary, not future. What about written sources, number 3? Well, there are 2 written sources mentioned for the first time in Joshua. The first one is this book of Jasher. Now, if you notice, it's in 2 places. That's Joshua 10:13, if you want to make that note there. And then again, it's mentioned in 2 Samuel 1. In 2 Samuel 1, it calls it the war of the bow. So most scholars would say these are war poems of the victory that the Israelites had in the conquest. So he's using printed material. Now, why do I say that? I think we are offended if these authors use something that was already written, and we're expecting God to have said something word for them because we've been unduly influenced by conservative scholars in America and their verbal inspiration theories to saying every one of these words came from God. And the problem is, when you get 2 of these accounts, if you try to do that to Kings and Chronicles, you're in big trouble because they are different in numbers, really different. So which one's inspired? See, you just can't ask that kind of question. It's just 2 different historians covering the same material. Number 4, accurate listing of ancient cities. Now, these cities are going to change their name in time, but the older name occurs in Joshua, which says what? It's historical. It's in Joshua's day. It wasn't written later. No. This was written in the same time period. I listed several for you there. Jerusalem is called Jebus at this point. This is the name of the city before David took it and made it the capital. Notice number D. Sihon is the big city in Phoenicia for the longest time. Sihon is the older capital, the large city. Only later does Tyre become the capital and the larger city. So the fact that it doesn't mention Tyre but mentions Sidon shows it's an ancient text. Now there are some editorial additions. I know none of us like it, but there they are. I've listed them for you. It talks about the later conquest of Hebron. It talks about the later conquest of Debir. It talks about Dan's migration to the north. Now that is later, after the division of the land. So, and number E, the phrase, unto this day. I am assuming that is a later person. And that here is someone writing, how long? I don't know. 1 generation, 10, I just don't know. But they're saying it's still just like that. We would say that too. I went back and looked at ETBU and it looked just like it did. That's the kind of thing we're saying here, okay? That's the kind of thing we're trying to say. All right, let's go to modern scholarship. Now, is this term hexatute something you have ever heard before? Now, penta is 5, hexa is 6. The vocabulary and the grammar between Deuteronomy and Joshua is pretty similar. But from Jewish sources, Joshua starts a brand new division of their canon. And I have tried to list some of the reasons that people say it's the same. It goes back into this JEDP theory. Remember, the name, using the word Yahweh, using the word Elohim, using the book of the law, they think is Deuteronomy, written much later, 621, and priest, written in 400. Now, friends, that's a long time from Joshua. Long time. If you'll notice number 3, notice the presuppositions of the theory. And so much of this, I feel like modern scholars use modern Western literary theory, project it back on ancient text, and try to critique the ancient text. I think it's just terribly inappropriate. But what I've shown you under 4a and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Jewish sources, and you may be familiar with these if you know these Jewish names, say that Joshua starts a new section. So you got Ecclesiasticus, it's sometimes called the Wisdom of Ben Sira. You've got Flavius Josephus in his writings. You've got the Masoretic text has a footnote from the Masoretic scholars saying this is a new section. And the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now remember, the Samaritans, like the Sadducees, only accept the writings of Moses. So they would not accept Joshua, which means they saw it as another part of the canon. Number B, internal evidence. And when I say the word Young there, this is E.J. Young. I trust him. He's very conservative. He's, of course, dead. Knows if he's right or not. But his book on the Old Testament is the one that I use a lot. There is a special use of the pronoun I and we, which says what? First person. This is the eyewitness, of course. The city of Jericho is spelled differently. Earlier spelling, later spelling. And notice number 3, and I think this is significant. I don't buy the names for God, but I do feel like certain titles for God are characteristic of certain books. There's a real hair pull among scholars about how many Isaiahs are there. Are there 2? Are there 3? And a lot of them base it on what they say that can't be predictive prophecy. He can't know about Cyrus. I really reject that. But one way to say there's a unity here is unique vocabulary appears in all 3 of those sections. Unique titles for God that aren't used everywhere else appear in those 3 sections. So this helps us many times, I think. And in this section, it's the God of Israel. 14 times in Joshua, never in the Pentateuch. Now that tells us it's a new writer in a new period. Now under this, sources for corroborating the historical setting, as you know, Christianity stands or falls on the historicity of the Bible. If the Bible is historically inaccurate, or if the Bible is mythology, or if the Bible is made up facts, we're in big trouble. We have no way to verify its truthfulness. So both Islam and Judaism and Christianity are historical-based religions, which means we've got to look for history. So what I've done here is try to do that. Now, number A, we've talked about this, but all the walled cities of Canaan are destroyed, burnt, and rapidly rebuilt. Now think what that is. They were overwhelmed, and then somebody moved in and tried to build the walls back. 1250. That fits the 1290 date for the Exodus, by the way. I've listed the names of those major cities there. You can check that. Archaeology has not been able to confirm or reject the biblical account of the fall of Jericho. Now you think we ought to, because it was a double wall, right? Which is somewhat unique for this period of Jericho. Now this again, there's no doubt that what the Bible says happened. The trick is, whenever these really, really ancient cities were conquered by another people, the next group that came in took the building material on the ground and rebuilt their buildings. So suddenly you can't do the stratification of archaeology anymore. In this part of time, Jericho is really a wet place. So there's a lot of weathering. There's a lot of multiple levels of civilization rebuilding this. So we just can't say yes or no about Jericho, about the Bible's account. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means we can't verify it. Now, notice that there is an altar on Mount Ebal. This is the Shechem. Shechem is a city. By the way, the word Shechem in Hebrew means shoulder blade. So what we're saying is there's a valley and 2 mountains, right? Shoulder blades. One is Mount Ebal. One is Mount Gerizim. You remember how the Levites went up on both mountains? One had the blessing and one had the cursing. It was a covenant renewal deal. Well, that's this. So that we have found an altar on Mount Ebal that is almost exactly the description of the altar we found in the Talmud, which again is, how would you make that up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later? So again, it's a historical confirmation, I think. Archaeology, number E, has confirmed the major empires. Now, the empire of Anatolia, you know it from the Bible as Hittites. And this is one of the evidence that I use for the Bible being historically accurate. So I'm going to do this real quick because I got a little time. The word Hittite never occurs outside the Bible in any ancient document. But it appears in the Bible over and over. It's an empire in Turkey. There are Hittite tribes among the Canaanite tribes. It's mentioned a lot. Well, scholars, liberal scholars would say, see, the Bible just made that whole group of people up. 1947, archaeologists, Central Turkey, found the royal cuneiform library of that empire. And lo and behold, now documented, this empire went by two names, Hittite and Anatolia. And that's not opinion, that is documented. So again, the historicity of the Bible is confirmed. But Egypt and then the powers of Mesopotamia are unable to exercise influence in Palestine during this period known as the Late Bronze Age. And you can see how that fits. Now that date would fit both theories of the Exodus, both 1445 and 1290. Okay, now number G, and I'm not going to go in this a lot, but it is here, and the famous book is listed, Mendelssohn's Law and Covenants in Israel and the Ancient Near East, number 1. Another point of historical confirmation is that the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, is written in a pattern that was characteristic of ancient treaty patterns. And it's so characteristic, you start listing who it is and what they've done, and here's the benefits, and if you don't keep it, here's the curses, and you got to make 2 copies, one for the king and one for the temple. It's almost exact. This treaty pattern, called the Hittite suzerain king treaties, changed from the 2000 BC period, that's Joshua, to the 1000 BC period. And I have forgotten exactly which one of the items changed, but one of them did. And Deuteronomy and Joshua fit the 2000 BC pattern. So someone writing hundreds of years later would not know that. It's another historical confirmation. And I think whenever we can find those, we ought to bring it up. But I've listed all that for you. I just don't feel like going through it point by point. Number 3, just to show you how this fits, Joshua. Identification of the king, that's Joshua 24:2. Narrative of the king's great acts, that's chapter 24, 2 through 13. Covenant obligations, Joshua 24, 14 and 23. Instructions for depositing the treaty in the sanctuary, Joshua 24, 25 and 26. Deities of the parties involved invoked as witnesses, Deuteronomy 24, 22. Blessings of fidelity and curses for violation, Joshua 24, 20. There it is. Now that special topic, Hittite suzerain treaties, if you want to have more information, if you'll click on that, it's even more than this, okay? I think it means royal is what it means, but it would be king, right? So royal or kingly. So this would be a treaty between 2 kings, and one of them is much more powerful. So it would be a greater king and a lesser king. And of course, it's Yahweh and the Israelites. Now let's look at the literary units. And I want to say again to you, people just never think about this really. I remember when I was in school, they used to say, do an outline, then write your paper, right? You remember saying that? Of course, none of us ever did that. But why do you do that? The way you outline is the logical way you present it, right? I mean, you think about, here's what I want to say. Here's the evidence for what I want to say. Here's the illustration of what I want to say. Here's the that's what the outline does, okay? When we go through the Bible, when you look up at a study Bible and it has the outline of the book, Roman numerals, then ABCs, those are literary units. Now, if it's true, and I believe it is, that every book of the Bible has one central meaning of an inspired person. So what you say to yourself is, and this is, I know you're not going to buy this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. You got to read the whole book before you can interpret any of the parts. Because you've got to see what the book is about. And you can't let someone's opinion about a modern issue or a moral issue or a personal opinion, it can't mean what it never meant. So the key is the intent of the original author and what the first hearers would have, could have, should have understood. And how do you do that? You look at the literary units. Just do the example real quick. Book of Romans, the longest introduction of any New Testament book. That's chapter 1, 1 through 16. Theme for the whole book, 17 and 18. First major point, all have sinned, 119 through 321. Right? And then, justification by grace through faith, Old Testament example, chapter 4. And then 5 and 6 are about justification by grace. What is grace? How does it function? Why does it function? And then you get to chapter 8, it's the great victory verse, right? No condemnation, no separation. And then, why has Israel missed this? 9 through 11. And then 12 through 15, here's how you live this new covenant. And then 16 is goodbye, y'all. Now, do you see how there's a flow there? So, you can't let someone pick 4 verses out of chapters 1 through 8 called the plan of salvation, jump an entire literary unit to why has Israel not believed, quote Romans 10, and say this is God's summary. Do you see how we're violating the intent of the original author by picking just some verses out of the overall presentation? Now, I think the Roman Road is a wonderful summary, but we must keep in mind it's a wonderful summary. It's one way to share it. The word "the" should never go in front of it, right? I'll repent later. Literary units. It's based on geographical movement. Not people, geography. Here it goes. They're on the plains of Moab. That's on the eastern side of the Jordan, looking into the promised land from Mount Nebo, right? Crossing the Jordan. That's chapter 3 and 4. Oh, it's so powerful. Just one that gets me. Did you know that the waters of the Jordan River are going to stop, right? Now, if you read it closely, it says, at Adam. Adam is a city upriver from where they crossed. Now, what it says, when the feet of the priests that carried the ark get in the water will be cut off. So what happened is, there was a landslide. You say, oh, Bob, there was a landslide at the city of Adam at the exact moment that completely dammed up the Jordan River until all the Israelis crossed. The guys with the ark had to stand there until all of them crossed. Then it opened up at the exact same supernatural moment. God uses natural events with supernatural timing. You say, I don't like that. Read the text clearly. It's the city of Adam. You can look at it and check it on a map. The central campaign, that means they're going to go right through the middle first. The northern campaign, so you get the central, southern, and northern. And then the geographical divisions of the promised land among the tribes, 12 through 21. I've done a brief outline for you there. I'm trying to get you to see how this thing moves through theological truths. So what are the main truths of Joshua? Then I'll let you talk to me. It demonstrates Yahweh's faithfulness to his promise to Abraham. Remember chapter 3 of Genesis. I'm going to give you a great name, right? I'm going to give you a land, and I'm going to give you a seed. Well, the Old Testament focuses on the land, and this goes back to Genesis 15 about God giving the Canaan to them, right? The sin of the Amorites not yet finished, but 400 years you're going to go down, I'll bring you out. So I think that's what that's talking about. And then in Genesis 15, 16 is where they're finally entering the promised land now. They've wandered for 38 years because of their unbelief. It continues the history begun in Genesis and brings it to a new period. This time, the tribal association. There's a funny little word we use, amphictyony. It's just a way of saying it was not a unified nation yet. It was tribal groups. So every tribe conducted its own area, had its own leaders, did its own thing. Amphictyony is the word they use for that. So we're not at a monarch, yes, not yet. We're not at, Saul, David, and Solomon. We're not there yet. We're earlier than that. There was no central government, is what I'm trying to say there. The next point, the concept of holy war. Now, this really bothers people, and I know it does, and there's no way to explain it except to say this. Have you ever watched a World War I battle where Germans threw gas over, we threw gas over, then thousands of men rushed out of one ditch and slaughtered in the middle, and you're going, how could they? It's the same with ancient battles. It was just huge numbers of people ran together and killed each other, and absolute bloody, horrible things. You say, well, that's terrible. See, the problem is you're judging the ancient world by what you think is appropriate. Now, what God is doing with holy war is he's saying, if you do not get rid of the Canaanites, they will pollute you. So what is holy war? Jericho belongs to God. It is holy. Everything that breathes in Jericho dies. And don't take any of the spoil because it belongs to God. That's what Achan did. And the Israeli army lost the battle the next day at a little bitty village called Ai. Little village. So what we're saying, a holy war is simply God protecting the purity of his people from Canaanite influence. And it may be offensive to you, but you got to judge it in light of its own day. The other kingdoms did the same way. In England, when there came a new king, and he killed every relative of the old king, men, women, children, killed them all. This, we would go, that's horrible. You're just spoiled rotten, what you are. You think fairness is something that moves through time. Cruelty moves through time. Expediency moves through time. God wanted a people to reflect his character, to bring the whole world to him. And he had to keep them from being polluted by Canaanite fertility worship. With all he did, it still didn't work. It still didn't work. I want to remind you that when God took the Canaanites out because of their sin, when Israel did the same thing the Canaanites did, God took them out too. It was his land, and he is not a respecter of persons. So when you have the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, and friends, I don't think you have any idea what those were like. The ancient texts tell us that the Assyrians put hooks in people's tongues and lips and nose, tied them together, walked them hundreds of miles, resettled them in someone else's home, and did the same thing to other captured people. They took the babies and burst their heads on the buildings. They killed all the leaders and old people to totally discourage the middle-aged people, that they would become a slave work group. You see, that's just horrible. We're just spoiled rotten. Thank God we live in America. But the world, for the most part, even today, doesn't know the kind of fairness that we think about. Okay, any questions or comments about Joshua or something else I've said? I'd be happy to talk to you.
You left out one important fact about Joshua.
What's that?
He didn't have any parents.
Son of none. Yeah, I was going to say that and I forgot it. Dadgum, it's one of my good jokes too. The son of none. Poor thing was just adopted, right? You know, those jokes are, I found in college, when you can do that, it just changes the atmosphere, right? It just changes the atmosphere. Joshua was son of none. That's right. Yeah. Yes. And this, again, you wonder what that meant, because it's going to be, if it just cut the water off, it had to be something like the east wind. Remember how it blew all night and made it dry at the Red Sea, Yam Suf? The same thing must have. So there's supernatural elements, but there's also natural elements. So if you wanted to disbelieve, say you were a pagan and said, "Oh, it was a landslide, it wasn't God," I think God gives those people an out. You know, I've seen it. It's muddy as a. There's people. When you go to Israel, they say, "Do you want to?"
I was there in 1966, and it was a dry riverbed.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Yeah, they started using these huge pipes to pull the water out for irrigation, so it got real dry. I got tickled. When you go, they say, do you want to be baptized in the Jordan River? Well, first of all, it's like a mud bath. And second, why do Christians who believe in being baptized one time want to be baptized in the Jordan? It's this, I don't know what. My mother said, "Would you get me a little jar of water from the Jordan?" "Yes, Mother, I will." So years later, it was on the mantle. And she said, "Oh, no, it's evaporated." I said, "Well, let me go fill that up from the sink." No. It's some holy, it's that superstitious element in us we got to watch out for. It's just water, friends. It's just water. It's muddy water. No. It was pretty when you were there, just wasn't a river, huh? Well, I forgot how big that pipe is that they're. You sweated for Jesus, didn't you? That was the closest you've been to how camels feel, I think, probably. Okay, well, next time we'll go to 1 Samuel. I'm trying to move through this a little quicker than taking a lot of time, but I sure do love chapter 1 of Joshua. It's so encouraging, and I love that story about the feet of the priests getting in the water and the landslide and all that. And there's a lot of Jewish tradition about Rahab and Joshua hooking up. But you just wonder if it's rabbis later on going, here's a love story for you. I don't know. You can't tell. That's right. Of course, my joke on that is you know Balaam's donkey was a female donkey. And what that does prove is that God can use women. Usually men laugh and women talk to me afterwards. So you were going to say...
People were afraid of something that, because of evidence, something happened 40 years earlier, they still knew about it.
Traditions, yeah. Yeah.
They were afraid because they knew what their God could do.
And of course, some of that they were afraid of was how they destroyed those other tribes as they moved through. So it was 40 years and up for that. Yeah, yeah. But just think, here is an inn in Jericho. It's not a Holiday Inn. This is another kind of place, right? But this lady had great faith and put her own life on the line to hide these spies, right? And Joshua honored it by her putting that red cloth out. Have you ever, just think about this. All you can do is speculate. Her end must have been on the outer wall because these spies are going to go over the wall. Now, there's a double wall. So, I don't know how her house met, but God just provided the neatest way. And they had to hide under flak. You think, why didn't you just make them invisible? I don't know. They hid under flak and got away with it and snuck out and went back and told Joshua, what's up? Yeah, right. That was very good, Paul. You've watched that show, huh? He's talking about Luke Skywalker is what he's doing. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I wish I'm going to quit now, but I wish you'd pray for me. I had to put Peggy in the rehab hospital today, and we're sure hoping that she'll get her strength back and we'll be able to go back to the office after 10 days or 2 weeks. So it's just difficult. Oh, please, I'd love for you to if you would.